Welcome to Nasdaq TradeTalks, where we meet with the top thought leaders and strategists in emerging technologies, digital assets, a regulatory landscape, and capital markets. I'm your host, Jill Malandrino, and joining me on the desk at the Nasdaq market site is Kevin Szczepanski, co-chair of the Data, Security, and Technology Practice Area at Barclay Damon, as well as Michael Kurzer, partner of technology transactions and intellectual property at Vinson and Elkins. We're here to discuss cybersecurity litigation trends on the state and federal levels and what that means for corporate compliance. We will also get into the tech side as well when we think about managing our data. It is great to have the both of you with us. It certainly is one of the most important topics that we're talking about right now in 2025. Kevin, what are some of the trends that stand out right now as you're thinking about data incidents and breaches and so forth?
I think the headline is that in 2025 you will pursue and be pursued when it comes to litigation. The number one cause of cyber insurance loss are data breach class actions brought about by ransomware. The ransomware threat actors are getting more sophisticated. They're using AI not only to identify vulnerabilities, but to streamline their attacks. And if one of the attacks works, then you have sensitive personal data of individuals that is compromised. You're going to have to provide notice, and businesses operating across the United States are going to have to comply with the breach notification laws of multiple states, and that gets the attention of regulators and, yes, the plaintiff's bar. And the frequency and cost of class action litigation is sadly on the rise.
It certainly is, that's for sure, in the U.S. legal system. Michael, part of it is almost self-inflicted wounds, if you will, because everything is either on a cloud infrastructure or it's in a data center. It's moving off-prem, or it is off-prem more so than before. So it's almost like it naturally opens up those vulnerabilities in a way.
Right, thank you, Jill. It's nice to be here again. Yes, I think you're right. So there's certainly a lot of concern around security in the cloud, and the type of cloud model that you use would definitely have an impact on what you do in terms of your cybersecurity governance program. Yeah, I think one of those areas that people have been focused on a lot lately are data centers and use of AI in data centers. Cybersecurity comes up in a number of ways in that space, but in data centers in general, you have physical as well as cybersecurity concerns, and the cybersecurity concerns are multiplied if you have more than one data center, or if you're using a cloud that's in another country, or it could be that you have all sorts of data that you don't even know is in a cloud. Right. So,
well, I mean, part of the challenge is the technology is moving so fast, right? So have you when you think about your cyber strategy, your data governance and privacy procedures and so forth, when you think about the overarching frameworks on the federal and state level, those really critical operational factors, not that it was an oversight, but the technology is just moving quicker than you can keep up with it.
Right, yeah, technology moves as fast as, it moves at the speed of light, if that's the way you'd like to put it. But I think the regulations don't move quite as fast as the technology moves. And so what you have are 2 or 3 years out after technology's been implemented, that the cyber regulators realize that there's an issue, and then they start the enforcement. And then the question is, what do you do with your business where you've already sort of moved down in the direction without taking into account these concerns? So, what I think the recommendation in that regard is that you need to do a risk assessment up front and really understand what your risks are, even for regulation that doesn't exist at the day that you develop your technology.
Yeah, and that's a good point. And Michael, it's one of those things where, Kevin, excuse me, it's one of those things where you don't set it and forget it. It's almost like a fire drill when you're thinking about mitigation, response, and figuring out where your vulnerabilities are. You just don't, set it, walk away. You have to constantly be preparing for this, because should you have to respond to an incident, you can't take your time with that. Let's put it like that.
No, you can't take your time, and that's why it's important to plan ahead. One of the things that every business should have, and I'm sure many watching will acknowledge they do have, is an incident response plan. And that's your roadmap for responding to a ransomware attack, data breach. But unfortunately, some businesses will set it and forget it, as you said. And what you really need to do is set it and then pull it out and revisit it, at least annually. And one of the things we're recommending to our clients now is our tabletop exercises, where you role play a simulated ransomware attack or cyber incident. And what that does is it causes you to fail. You will fail, hopefully not in the first 5 minutes, but you will eventually fail during that simulation. But the failure is good because that's what enables you to identify and shore up the weaknesses that you will have addressed by the time you suffer the inevitable actual attack.
Right, and I think it's also an important distinction to make that cyber insurance policies, when you have an incident, it's not covered by traditional commercial insurance. Are you recommending that companies also have a separate, space and consider, resources allocated to cyber policies?
Yes, there was a time, Jill, when I thought, I don't need to remind everyone to have a cyber insurance policy. Everybody knows that. But truth be told, not everyone has one. We've been working on responding to a ransomware incident for a client who does not have one. And yes, cyber insurance is an invaluable risk management tool because it covers you for those first-party losses, like the costs of responding to a ransomware attack or a data breach, and also those third-party costs. So if you get sued by a class of individuals whose data you failed to protect, you have a defense and payment for judgments and settlements as well. So absolutely should have a cyber insurance policy.
And Michael, it's interesting because you point out in an article you recently co-authored that when you think about physical servers and software in a data center, procurement, implementation, maintenance of these servers and software includes several third-party relationships and agreements, and if there is an incident there, it's a domino effect.
Right, Jill, and I'll add to what Kevin said. I think cyber insurance is definitely important for the very reason that you're pointing out, that you might have third parties involved. The bigger issue these days is that, just as with the fires in California, insurance companies will look to find a way not to cover you if they think the risks are too great. So it really depends on the industry that you're in or what you might be doing with your data as to whether or not you're able to get a cyber policy that will protect you adequately. In many cases, if you look at 10K disclosures of companies, of public companies, you'll see that they say we may or may not be able to keep our cyber insurance because coverage keeps declining. So is there an example of an industry that is more vulnerable than others, where your premiums might be higher because the risk is higher? Right. I think anything where you're handling a lot of consumer, for example, credit card data or personal data, healthcare, definitely a higher risk. Yes. Yeah. Well, it's interesting because as attorneys, you're thinking about how you're negotiating these different types of agreements to protect yourself and your customers. That opens up a whole other area of practice that you need to be prepared for as well. Right. Yeah. So you mentioned both service providers who might be providing something to you, and then downstream you have your customers. When you think about that relationship, you have an agreement that with your service provider that will address in some way cybersecurity, and you have those obligations that you're making to your customer on the other end. And so one key question in that is going to be whether or not you've aligned those two. Have you agreed to give something to your customer that you haven't backed up in your agreement with the service provider that's providing that service to you? Yeah, it seems like in cyber, Kevin, you're always playing a game of 4D chess. Because by the way, the bad actors are leveraging the same technology that the good actors are, and they're well funded too, by the way. Yes, they are, and they only have to be right once. You have to be right 100 times out of 100. One of the challenges that we're seeing, I think Cyber Insurance 1.0 was get the coverage because it's relatively inexpensive and it's a great risk management tool. What we're seeing in Cyber 2.0 is clients coming to us saying, okay, we have a dispute with our vendor, we both have cyber insurance, but whose policy pays first? And if you're not careful in planning how, the priority of coverage, you can have a situation where you've suffered a significant loss, as you were alluding to, Michael, and the carriers are pointing to each other saying, no, you pay, no, you pay. So that's something, again, that can be managed in the planning and drafting phase, but you don't want to find out that you have that problem after the loss. Right. Well, another area of complexity, too, is you're dealing with multiple jurisdictions, especially when you think about, how privacy is and data is governed.
you have the state level, you have the federal level, and they're not always all consistent. So you're mandated to comply to multiple jurisdictions, which not only makes it more expensive and complicated, we're also in an environment where things are evolving rapidly.
Yes, they are, and add to that international privacy laws. So if you have data in the European Union or you're doing business there, you have to comply with the GDPR, the Global Data Privacy Regulation, and also coming into effect this year is the EU AI Act, which is going to increase the obligation of businesses across the world to provide adequate oversight, safety, transparency. And as you said, things are changing rapidly here. That's going to stand in stark contrast, I think, to what appears to be the domestic side evolution of AI law. We seem to be going in the other direction. So it's going to be increasingly difficult, I think, for businesses to comply.
I think another part of the challenge is we're seeing how executive orders are being leveraged. So these aren't necessarily being legislated, which I think adds another element of complexity as well, because executive orders, they can come and go quite rapidly.
Yes.
And you have elected representatives that you expect to legislate for you. The EU, for example, that's a cohesive piece of legislation for all the nations there. I'm curious to see exactly how this will play out, because executive orders have kind of come out fast and furious.
I think we're going to find out later this year. So we had the president's executive order of a couple of weeks ago essentially rescinded the Biden administration's executive orders on cybersecurity. But it didn't replace those old executive orders with anything. Basically, what we have is a general directive to promote innovation, and we should see an AI plan within 180 days. So we know what's no longer in effect, but we don't know what's going to replace it yet.
Yeah, that's kind of, well, that's a little bit concerning when you're operating in a vacuum.
Yeah, I'll add to what Kevin said. So I think if you look at what Trump's did, so he one executive order repealed Biden's AI executive order, but he left in place, at least for now, the cybersecurity protections for the government. So Trump, at least, as chaotic as things might seem elsewhere, he does seem to be at least aligned on cybersecurity as it protects government information. AI, in terms of innovation, I think he's of a mind that less regulation is better. But companies don't operate in a vacuum. So if they're selling globally, the EU AI Act is still out there, and it's not as if they can just
it was like
operate.
a GDPR. If you were an asset manager and you wanted to have clients in the EU, that was your choice. You either comply or you don't have business in the EU. I guess when you think about how you're advising clients, what are you working off of then? What's currently in place, or be prepared as best as you can?
Right. It's very difficult. I think with respect to cyber protections, I think you can say to them, you need to have the highest level of cybersecurity protection. Trump is not going to let you off the hook in that regard. With respect to AI and development, you might have a little bit more leeway development-wise in the US, but you ultimately have to think how you're going to use that product. Now, also, what's happening in the US is that the states are getting into the game, and you've got Colorado, you've got Utah, and you've got California. Colorado taking a risk-based approach with the AI similar to the EU AI Act, and that will come online in 2026. So it's not as if you can just be safe under the executive order and not have to worry about regulation of AI in the US.
Well, I mean, particularly California. It's notorious for having really stringent data laws and so forth.
Very robust. And I think to build on Michael's point, because it's a good one, even in an uncertain environment like this, I think it's fair to say that regulators don't develop cybersecurity standards out of whole cloth. They borrow from governmental organizations like NIST, the National Institute of Standards and Technology, and of course, California leads the country in privacy, and the EU leads the country, if you're doing business there at least, with GDPR and the looming AI Act. So there are some options. There are places where businesses can go and make some strategic choices about what they're going to do. I think, frankly, it's going to be, you can have both, right? There's a false dichotomy between innovation and security and transparency. I think going forward, what we're going to see, and maybe this administration will come to that conclusion, we'll have to see how it plays out, we're going to end up with both. Otherwise, domestic businesses are going to be at a disadvantage because they're going to have one set of laws to comply with here and another set in the EU.
Right. Well, when we think about it, a hybrid solution, whether it's for, tech execution and so forth, everything should probably act on, on a hybrid way. This way you do have options. It's almost like you have a redundancy automatically put in place. On a more granular level, though, we keep hearing about moving to zero trust. Almost trust nothing and try and protect your vulnerabilities as much as you possibly can. And that starts from the ground level.
Yes, it does. So as a backdrop, we used to think of our security perimeter as us and then everyone else. So the perimeter was on the outside of your organization, just like a fence around your house. But what we found in recent years is that having a perimeter at that level is insufficient to protect yourself because you face inside threats as well, and threat actors acting on the outside can get into your network and impersonate users. So you are unable to see the actual malicious attack because the threat actor is using legitimate tools and codes to get in. So we're moving to a place of zero trust, and that is the concept that says we're going to assume that everything is a breach unless we verify. So we're going to make sure that Kevin he's properly authenticated, he's going only where he should go, he's accessing only the data that he should access. And in the long run, that's going to make us all safer. It's going to mitigate risk and bend the cost curve down.
Yeah, and Michael, when you think about data centers and the systems that support that, you're looking at critical infrastructure at this point as well, which I think is something noteworthy.
Right. Yeah. So there, in that regard, there's federal legislation in place to address exactly that, to address critical infrastructure and cybersecurity. What you have right now are proposed rules which are still to be finalized as to what exactly will be critical infrastructure. What about the transport between the critical infrastructure? The pipelines, the railroads, all of those are going to be subject to cybersecurity reporting requirements and obligations to have in place detailed plans and assessments to know what's their level of risk and to be able to report very quickly when they have an incident.
Yeah. We're at an interesting crossroads because you don't want perfect to be the enemy of good, because as an enterprise you still have other areas of focus in terms of R&D and product development and revenue lines and so forth, and that balancing that I think is really where the challenge is.
Yeah, certainly there's whenever you talk about regulation, you're looking at, well, how am I going to run my business when I'm spending millions of dollars on complying with regulations that I feel don't necessarily come up very often in my business. And I think that's a legitimate concern. I think people have, in some ways, adapted to things. Kevin mentioned zero trust. I think people have gotten used to things like multi-factor authentication, having text sent to their phone whenever they're relogging into something they've logged into 1,000 times. I think the same happens at a corporate level with respect to cybersecurity adoption and programs, in that you get used to it. You recognize this is a cost of doing business. This is the new norm. It's the new way things will be, and you go from there.
It certainly is, Michael. And to your point earlier, they only have to be right once.
Right.
Right.
That's right. And yet I think there's an opportunity here,
okay.
Jill. I think that we can turn the challenges, regulatory and otherwise, into an opportunity. If the board of a corporation really grabs the bull by the horns, so to speak, and says, we are going to oversee the deployment and maintenance of our information security networks. We're going to ask the right questions. What are our safeguards? What are we spending? Asking the CISO, if you had a bigger budget, what 3 priorities would you have? And then trying to sort out how to move the way forward. I think that those are the businesses that will be in the strongest position to deal with the AI changes, the regulatory landscape going forward.
Yeah, that's a great point that you make, and why you're seeing the composition of boards start to include
Yep.
more cybersecurity professionals and
Exactly.
practitioners. All right, appreciate both of your insights. Thanks for joining us on Trade Talks. I'm Jill Malandrino, Global Markets Reporter at Nasdaq.